Camp Seagullville, Texas, Christmas week, 1944. The wind was dry, the chapel on the hill looked more like a barn, and the German women walked in silence. No chains, no shouting. Just the sound of boots on gravel and the low hum of a song they didn't recognize. Anneliese hadn't volunteered because she believed in their God. She volunteered because she missed her mother's kitchen, her church's bells, the smell of pine. But when she stepped into that American church, something happened that none of them had been prepared for. Even their prayers sounded different. Anneliese was 19 the winter she became a prisoner of war, not a soldier, not a criminal, just a girl caught in the jaws of her country's failure. Back in Leipzig, her father had been a stern man, one of the engineers who worked under the Reich's prized programs, and her mother had been devout in her own cold way, candles lit not out of joy, but obedience. Religion in their home was a performance, something that echoed more fear than faith. When Anneliese was taken, she had already learned how to harden her heart. The train ride across the Atlantic had dulled her senses. The Texas sun had burned her face raw, but it was nothing compared to the ache of invisibility to walk through someone else's country as the enemy. Seagullville was quieter than she expected. The guards were polite, almost uncomfortable. The food was strange, but edible. And the other girls, some of them mothers, some barely women, carried themselves like ghosts in cotton dresses. Time passed in rations and letters that rarely arrived. But then came the whisper of something strange, an invitation. A church in town wanted to host them for Christmas service. Voluntary, the American lieutenant had said, as if the word meant anything anymore. Some girls laughed, others rolled their eyes. "They want to convert us," one muttered. Anneliese said nothing. That night, she sat on the edge of her bunk, staring out through the frosted wire. Back home, her mother would be roasting chestnuts. Her younger brother would be setting fire to the edges of the Advent wreath. She hadn't prayed in months. She wasn't even sure what she believed anymore. But she remembered the silence of Christmas Eve, the kind that pressed against your ribs and made you feel both small and wanted. So the next morning, when the guards called out for volunteers, Anneliese stood. She didn't know what she was walking toward, but she was tired of pretending that nothing still lived inside her. As she stepped through the open gate, past the confused eyes of her fellow prisoners, she wondered for the first time in months if something else might be waiting for her beyond barbed wire. Not freedom, not forgiveness, but maybe something quieter. The bus was old and painted an awkward shade of green, like something forgotten in a barn. Its windows rattled, and the seats smelled faintly of hay and oil. Anneliese sat near the middle, flanked by two girls from Bavaria who whispered nervously in dialect. No one was shackled. No one guarded them with rifles. Only a single American officer sat near the front, arms crossed but relaxed, his cap tilted back like he didn't expect trouble. It felt more like a school field trip than a prisoner transport. That made it worse. The enemy was supposed to be brutal, cold, inhuman. But this was confusing, this kindness, this casualness. One of the girls asked if they'd be forced to confess their sins in front of the Americans. Another said she'd heard they put crosses everywhere and talked about blood. Anneliese said nothing. She kept her eyes on the dry Texas fields outside, where barbed fences gave way to open roads and white clapboard houses. She hadn't seen a child in months. Now, out the window, a little boy was riding a tricycle down a dusty lane, a red ribbon tied to the handlebars. He waved. She froze. She didn't wave back. At the edge of town, the church appeared. Not a cathedral, not even a chapel like back home. It looked like a barn with a steeple, wooden, plain, painted in soft cream with green shutters and a crooked bell tower. A few townspeople stood outside, bundled in coats. Some held hymn books. Some held paper bags that smelled like oranges and cinnamon. As the bus slowed, Anneliese felt something twist in her stomach. This wasn't what she expected. Where were the lectures? The warnings? The suspicious eyes? Instead, as they stepped down from the bus, one of the American women, maybe 50, in a maroon coat with fur at the collar, handed her a wrapped piece of peppermint candy and said, "Merry Christmas." Sweetheart, the word caught her off guard. Sweetheart, no one had called her that in years. Anneliese nodded stiffly, tucked the candy in her coat pocket, and followed the line of girls toward the doors. Inside, warmth, not just from the stove or the candles, but from the people. The walls smelled like old wood and vanilla. The pews were padded in red velvet. Someone had draped garlands of pine across the beams, and glass ornaments sparkled under strands of warm yellow lights. She took her seat near the back. There was no segregation, no warning line drawn between enemy and citizen. They were just part of the room now. Somewhere, a choir was humming softly. A boy giggled. An old man whispered a prayer. And as the church bell rang out once, then twice, Anneliese realized this wasn't a trap. It was something stranger. They had invited them to witness joy. The church filled slowly, like water rising in a quiet well. American families shuffled in, brushing snowless dust from their coats, their cheeks pink from cold wind. Children were everywhere, clinging to their mothers, tugging at their fathers' sleeves, peeking shyly at the line of German girls seated in the back. No one said anything cruel. No one stared too long. If anything, they looked unsure, curious. Anneliese sat rigid, her hands folded in her lap, the peppermint still untouched in her coat pocket. She wasn't used to being watched with softness. Back in Leipzig, her instructors had trained them to see Americans as weak, sentimental, undisciplined. Yet here they were clean, calm, organized, gentle. A woman with silver curls handed out small candle holders to each pew. Anneliese accepted one, her fingers brushing the woman's. "We're glad you're here," she whispered. "Not welcome, not forgiven, but glad." That was somehow worse. A choir of young voices assembled at the front. No uniforms, no medals. Just children in white shirts and red sashes, fiddling with sheet music and whispering excitedly as a man raised his hand. Silence fell. And then the first note, "O Holy Night." It began quiet, almost timid. The melody climbed gently, like footsteps in snow. The lyrics were in English, but Anneliese knew enough to understand the shape of them. She had sung the German version in her school, years ago, though it had been revised, stripped of certain lines, repurposed for pride. But this was different. "Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother." Her breath caught. She looked around. No one else seemed shocked. The Americans sat comfortably, nodding, some with eyes closed, some humming along. Anneliese gripped the candle tighter. That line would never have been allowed back home. It wasn't patriotic. It wasn't useful. It was dangerous. But here, it was sung with reverence, not as rebellion but as truth. The rest of the service unfolded like a warm tide. A prayer for the sick, a reading from the Gospel of Luke, a solo performance by a girl no older than 12 whose voice quivered but never broke. Anneliese didn't understand every word, but she understood the tone. There was no triumph, no blood, no glory, only longing, softness, hope, the kind of hope you couldn't weaponize. And it made her nervous. Her spine ached from sitting so still. Her mind kept searching for the twist, the sermon that would accuse them, the glance that would pierce like a blade. But none came. Even the pastor, a tall man with worn hands and kind eyes, spoke with gentleness. He prayed not for victory, but for peace, for unity, for the prisoners by name. Anneliese felt her throat tighten. Something inside her wanted to run, not because she was afraid of harm, but because she didn't know how to carry kindness. She had crossed through the wire, expecting surveillance. Instead, they had given her something worse. They had given her grace. The boy in the front row couldn't have been older than 7. His hair stuck out in every direction like he'd been wrestling angels, and his shirt was half untucked beneath a wool vest. He sat beside his mother, legs swinging beneath the pew, face lit by the glow of the candles now being passed down the rows. Anneliese tried not to look at him, but every so often he'd glance back at the German girls with the kind of open curiosity only a child could get away with. No suspicion, no fear, just wonder. When their eyes met, he smiled, not a polite twitch, but a full, innocent beam. Anneliese blinked, startled. Her lips moved before she could stop them, curling into a small, reluctant smile in return. It felt foreign, like she'd borrowed the gesture from someone else. She hadn't smiled like that in years. The choir started another hymn, softer this time. The candles flickered in a synchronized sea of gold. Everyone stood. The pastor asked them to hold their lights high, a symbol, he said, of the light that came into darkness. Anneliese stood with the rest, raising her candle, though her arm trembled slightly. Around her, The American congregation sang with closed eyes and open faces. She scanned them slowly, the mother with the crooked glasses mouthing every word with tear-streaked cheeks, the old man gripping his hymn book like it was the last thing he owned, the boy still watching her with that radiant, stubborn smile. She didn't understand how they could be this unguarded. Didn't they remember who she was, who she represented? Anneliese had seen American bombers overhead. She'd crouched in cellars while sirens screamed, cradling her younger brother as buildings shattered. She had seen what these people's country had done. And yet, here they were, handing her fire and asking her to sing. A part of her wanted to reject it, to fold her arms and retreat into the steel-boned pride she had been raised with. But another part, small, aching, buried, wanted to be warm again, wanted to believe this room was real, that the boy's smile was not rehearsed, that peace could exist between enemies, even for one night. Her eyes returned to the candle in her hand. The flame danced, alive but fragile. She thought of her mother's Advent wreath, the one with wax drippings hardened like frozen tears. She thought of the pews back home, stiff and cold, her father's hands folded in strict reverence. And she realized something unsettling. This felt more sacred, more real. She did not understand it, but she wanted to. As the final note of the hymn rose like breath into the rafters, Anneliese lowered her candle and whispered something only she could hear. Not quite a prayer, not yet, but something close, something that reached. After the service, the air outside felt heavier, as if the world had shifted while they were inside. The sun had dipped low, and the sky was painted in quiet streaks of amber and gray. The townspeople gathered in clusters outside the church, shaking hands, exchanging hugs, offering homemade paper bags filled with oranges, nuts, and something that smelled sweet molasses cookies, perhaps. The German girls lingered near the edge of the steps, unsure of their place. No one had told them what came next. There were no orders, no barked commands, just gentle chatter and flickering candle smoke rising into the evening air. Anneliese stood still, her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. The peppermint from earlier pressed into her palm, slightly melted now. She hadn't spoken a word all evening, not to the Americans, not even to the other girls. Silence had felt safer, a kind of armor. But then, the old woman from before, the one in the maroon coat, approached again. Her face was weathered but kind, the kind that came with grief and years, not softness. She held out a scarf, navy blue, hand-knit, slightly lopsided. "It's cold," she said simply, offering it like a peace treaty. Anneliese hesitated. The others were watching. To accept it felt like weakness, or betrayal, but her fingers were stiff and the wool looked warm. She reached out slowly and took it. "Danke," she said, too softly for most to hear. The woman nodded once, then leaned in slightly, eyes shining. "I've been praying for you," she said. "Not you all, not the prisoners. You." The sentence hit like a stone, dropped gently into still water, no splash, just ripples that kept expanding inside her. Anneliese didn't know what to say. She couldn't remember the last time someone had prayed for her by name. Her teachers had prayed for the Führer. Her mother had prayed for the strength to endure. But no one had ever looked into her eyes and said they prayed for her, not as a soldier, not as a citizen, but as a person, a girl, a soul. The scarf in her hands suddenly felt heavier than it should have. She wanted to ask why. Why her? Why now? What could possibly be the point of praying for someone who had stopped believing in anything at all? But the woman just gave her hand a gentle squeeze and turned back toward the church steps. No sermon, no lesson, just a scarf and a sentence. Anneliese tucked the wool beneath her coat and looked out across the street. Children were still playing. The pastor was hugging an old man. The boy from the pew was waving at her again. And for a moment, just a moment, she wished she didn't have to go back behind the wire. The ride back to camp was quieter than the one that brought them. The girls didn't whisper this time. No one joked about propaganda. They just sat, eyes distant, hands folded in their laps, each holding some quiet piece of the evening that didn't quite fit into the world they knew. Anneliese stared out the window. The sky had deepened into indigo, stars beginning to pierce through. The streets of the small Texas town glowed faintly behind them, Christmas lights still flickering on porches, children's laughter echoing faintly. A world moving forward as if war was only something written in newspapers. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and tried to replay the service in her mind, but the words slipped away too easily. Only pieces remained: the candlelight, the boy's smile, that hymn, the one about chains breaking, about brothers and freedom. She didn't know what it meant exactly, but she felt it, not in her mind, but in her chest. Like someone had knocked gently on a door that had been shut for too long. The bus hit a rut in the dirt road, and her seat jolted beneath her. The scarf in her pocket brushed against her ribs. She pulled it out and ran her fingers over the uneven stitching. Blue wool, slightly too short, warm in a way that had nothing to do with heat. She had never seen that woman before, didn't even know her name. But she had looked at her, truly looked, not as a German, not as a prisoner, but as someone worthy of a gift. The thought made her throat tighten. Ahead, the familiar outline of Camp Siegelville appeared. Barbed wire fencing, watchtowers, the guarded silence that swallowed them each evening like fog. As the bus pulled through the gates, the guards gave a lazy nod, hardly glancing inside. This was routine now. Women going out, women coming back. Nothing dangerous, nothing urgent. But Anneliese felt different. Not in a way she could explain, not in a way she trusted, just different. Like something inside her had shifted ever so slightly off its axis. As they filed out and walked back toward the barracks, someone behind her whispered, "That wasn't what I expected." Anneliese didn't respond, but the words stayed with her. No, it wasn't. It wasn't cold. It wasn't political. It wasn't cruel. It was human, and she didn't know what to do with that. That night, as she lay on her bunk, staring at the wooden beams above her, she found herself humming, barely audible, more breath than sound, just a fragment of melody, the hymn from the church. Fall on your knees. She didn't know the rest, but she hummed that one line until she drifted into sleep, the scarf tucked under her arm like a secret too soft to speak aloud. The next morning came without fanfare. Breakfast was powdered eggs and burnt toast. The barracks creaked in the wind, and the guards moved with their usual disinterest. But something about the air felt altered, like the silence had gained weight. Anneliese sat at the long table, her tin cup warm in her hands, staring at the steam rising from weak coffee. Across from her, one of the other girls, Marta, tall, red-haired, always quick with sarcasm, was quiet for once. She kept turning something over in her lap. Anneliese realized it was a folded piece of paper, a hymn sheet. Marta looked up. Their eyes met. No words passed between them, but it was clear they were both carrying the night before in some fragile pocket of the soul. Later that day, as the girls were peeling potatoes in the kitchen shed, someone began to hum. It was off-key, hesitant, but unmistakable, the church melody again. Anneliese paused, knife in hand, and listened. Another voice joined in, then another. No one said anything. No one made fun. They just hummed, quietly, cautiously, like they were afraid the guards might hear and laugh, or worse, understand. That evening, after roll call, Anneliese found herself walking the perimeter of the fence alone. She needed air, space. Her thoughts had grown louder than the camp itself. She replayed the pastor's voice in her mind. He had prayed for them by name. He had not asked God to change them or shame them. He had simply asked that they be seen. Even the enemy has a soul, he had said. Not angrily, not with disdain, just truthfully, like he believed it with every breath in his body. That sentence had struck something deep. She remembered the prayers from home, dry, mechanical, delivered from pulpits carved like fortresses. God was power, God was wrath, God chose winners. But in that church, God had sounded like mercy, like someone willing to listen, even when you had nothing left to say. She wasn't sure which version she feared more. That night, as the lights dimmed in the barracks and the room grew still, Anneliese reached into the folds of her thin mattress and pulled out the scarf. She wrapped it around her hands, not because it was cold, but because it reminded her of something she couldn't name. A kindness she hadn't asked for, a moment she hadn't deserved. She whispered words into the dark. Not prayers, not exactly, just thoughts she wanted to aim at something higher than the ceiling. A question formed on her tongue. If they could forgive her, could God? She didn't say it out loud, not yet, but the thought stayed. And somehow, it didn't feel as foolish as it once had. 2 days later, word came down that the same church was opening its doors again. A follow-up service, the American said, for anyone who wished to return. No pressure, just warmth, music, and prayer. The guards read the announcement like it was any other notice about latrine duties or schedule changes. But the room shifted as soon as they left. Girls glanced at each other, uncertain. Some murmured that one visit was enough. Others joked that maybe this time they'd try to baptize them all. Anneliese said nothing. She folded laundry with her eyes fixed on the floor, heart thudding quietly in her chest. She wanted to go, but the wanting scared her. That night, as they washed dishes in a row, Marta nudged her with an elbow and said, "Are you going back?" Anneliese didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she said finally. "It's not like we belong there." Marta shrugged. "We didn't belong the first time either, didn't stop them." Anneliese nodded. But that was what made it worse. It wasn't the invitation that frightened her. It was the ease of it. The way those people had looked at her, not with contempt or suspicion, but with genuine welcome, as if she weren't wearing the face of their enemy, as if her accent didn't belong to a regime they hated. And that kind of grace, the unearned kind, always came with a cost. The next morning, while the sun was still low and the frost clung to the corners of the windows, one of the American women arrived at the camp gates. Not a soldier, a civilian. The same one, with the maroon coat and silver hair. She asked to see the girls. Not all of them, just a few. Anneliese was on the list. She stepped outside, squinting in the morning light. The woman smiled and handed her something wrapped in brown paper. It was a small book, a pocket-sized hymnal. No explanation. Just a soft smile and, "I thought you might want it." Anneliese opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes stung. She accepted the book with both hands, nodded in silence, and stepped back inside before the tears could betray her. That night, she stared at the pages long after lights out. The words were in English. She couldn't understand most of them. But she remembered the sounds, the melodies, the warmth of that sanctuary. And the scarf, still folded beneath her pillow, seemed to pulse with quiet memory. She thought of the pastor's voice, the boy's smile, the candlelight pressed into her hands. She could go again. She was allowed. But she couldn't yet. Something inside her needed more time. To trust, to believe, to forgive herself. She placed the book gently beside the scarf. Not a rejection, not yet acceptance, just waiting. A soul not ready to kneel, but no longer ready to run. The music stayed with her. It clung to the corners of her thoughts like dust in sunlight, refusing to settle. Even as she scrubbed pots in the kitchen or mended uniforms in the sewing room, the melodies would rise again, uninvited, untranslatable, but somehow unforgettable. She would hum them quietly, beneath her breath, just enough to feel them tremble in her chest. She hadn't asked to be moved, hadn't intended to carry those songs with her, but they returned like the scent of something familiar and long lost. One afternoon, as she worked by the laundry line, folding sheets alongside a younger girl named Greta, the wind picked up suddenly. A corner of a linen sheet flapped free, revealing the torn edge of the church bulletin Anneliese had tucked into her apron. Greta glanced at it, then at her. "You went," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Anneliese nodded. Greta lowered her voice. "What was it like?" Anneliese hesitated. "How do you explain the ache of hearing something beautiful in a place you were told would hate you? How do you describe being handed warmth by someone you would have never trusted before the war?" "It was strange," she said finally. "Kind." Greta didn't reply, but her hands moved slower after that, folding each sheet with more care, as if the air itself had changed. That night, Anneliese returned to her bunk early. The barracks were dim, only a few murmurs passing through the bunks like drifting smoke. She pulled the small hymnal from beneath her mattress and opened to a page at random. The letters were foreign, but the shape of the words stirred something deep. She didn't need to know the meaning. She remembered the feeling that moment when the choir had risen in unison, their voices lifting into the rafters like smoke toward heaven. "Fall on your knees," she whispered it now. Just those 4 words, half remembered and half guessed. Her voice cracked halfway through, but she said it again, slower. This time, not just as a memory, but almost as a question. What was it about those words? The way they bent the heart, the way they stripped pride without violence. She had never knelt for anything in her life except duty and command. This felt different. Not demanded, not forced, just offered. The scarf still lay beside her pillow. She wrapped it loosely around her shoulders, not for warmth, but for the memory of the hand that gave it. And for a brief moment, as the wind pushed against the walls outside and the shadows stretched long across the wooden floor, Anneliese closed her eyes and imagined she was back in that church candle in hand, a stranger's voice in her ear, and the sound of peace wrapping around her like a hymn with no end. It began with humming, soft at first, almost accidental. One voice in the barracks, then another, then silence again. But by the end of the week, the melody had woven itself through the camp like smoke, slipping through cracks in a wall. Not loud, not defiant, just present. The song had no clear beginning, no chorus they all understood, but they remembered the sound, the warmth of the candlelight, the feeling of being seen. Anneliese noticed it most in the quiet places over dishwater, beside the clothesline, as they folded laundry or waited for head count. The notes would rise, unsure but tender, pass between them like a secret. Some didn't know where the song came from. Others had only heard it once, but still carried its echo. The camp guards didn't seem to mind. If they noticed, they said nothing. Maybe they thought it harmless. Maybe they didn't recognize the song at all. Or maybe, just maybe, they understood that this wasn't rebellion. It was grief trying to heal. One night, as snow threatened but never fell, Marta stood up after lights out and whispered into the dark, "What do you think it means?" A few girls stirred. One laughed softly. What means?" "The song," Marta said. "The part about chains breaking, about the soul feeling its worth." No one answered. Anneliese lay still, staring up at the beams. Her heart beat faster. That line had followed her like a shadow. She hadn't even known the phrase in English until she found it in the hymnal, buried between unfamiliar verses. She turned the words over now like stones in her hand. What did it mean for a soul to feel its worth? She had never been taught that a soul had worth unless it served something. A father, a flag, a cause. The idea that it was enough just to be, not to prove, not to earn, was a kind of blasphemy in the world she had come from. And yet, in that wooden church, surrounded by strangers and forgiveness she hadn't asked for, she had felt something shift. Not all at once, but enough to notice, enough to ache. The next day, while polishing silverware, she caught Greta humming again. This time, the tune was clearer. A few others joined in, instinctively adjusting to the pitch. They were smiling, not at each other, but to themselves, like the memory of that night had bloomed into something they could carry. Not everyone joined. Some rolled their eyes, some turned away. But no one stopped them, no one scolded. And that, too, felt like a kind of miracle. In a place built to remind them they had lost, a song was reminding them they were still alive. And somehow, without permission, that was beginning to feel like hope. Anneliese sat cross-legged on her bunk, pencil in hand, a blank sheet of paper balanced across her knees. It was supposed to be a letter to her mother, her first in weeks. The camp allowed them to send one page at a time, folded neatly, inspected before it ever crossed the wire. She had written dozens before, most filled with safe phrases. "The food is tolerable. I am well. The guards are not cruel." But this time, the words refused to come. She stared at the page, tapping the pencil against her knee, her mind returning again and again to the church. To the boy in the front row, to the pastor's tears, to the sound of voices lifting something invisible and sacred into the rafters. She had wanted to write about it, about how it had unspooled something tight inside her chest, how it had made her question the shape of what she believed. But how could she explain it to her mother, a woman who had only ever prayed with clenched hands and a bowed head, who had taught her to fear God more than trust him? How could she describe grace in a world that had no word for it in the Reich's vocabulary? She tried. She wrote one sentence, then scratched it out. Then another. "I went to an American church." Gone. They sang about peace. Gone. She folded the page in half, then quarters, then crumpled it entirely. She would send nothing. It was better that way. Some things didn't survive translation. She lay back and stared at the ceiling. Above her, the wooden beams were worn smooth from years of dust and breath and waiting. She wondered how many prayers had been whispered here, not to a god, but to chance, to time, to anyone listening. Her own hadn't formed yet. She wasn't ready. But something in her longed to speak anyway. She turned on her side and reached beneath her thin mattress, fingers brushing the scarf and the small hymnal tucked beside it. She pulled both out and held them in her lap like relics. The scarf still smelled faintly of lavender. The hymnal's corners were soft now, worn from quiet hands and hesitant fingers. She opened to a page near the middle and ran her thumb over the words. She couldn't read the full verse, but she remembered the rhythm. She closed her eyes. In the dark, the lines floated up like smoke. A thrill of hope. The weary world rejoices. She whispered it once. Then again, not because she understood it fully, but because it felt true. She folded the hymnal closed and placed it beside her, then tucked the scarf under her pillow. The letter would remain unwritten, but the words were still alive, somewhere inside her waiting for the day she had the courage to say them out loud. Christmas Eve arrived without snow, but the sky turned a deeper kind of gray, the kind that made even the wind sound hollow. There were no decorations in the barracks, no songs playing, no candles to light. The mess hall served cabbage soup and hard bread, like it did every night. Still, something in the air had changed. Anneliese sat alone near the back of the hall, her tray mostly untouched. Around her, the other girls spoke in low murmurs, some recalling holidays from home, others falling quiet, unsure if it was better to remember or to forget. No one mentioned the war. No one mentioned God. The silence between them held too much of both. She glanced out the frosted window toward the chapel in the town below. Faint golden light spilled from its windows, blurred and flickering in the dusk. Somewhere, someone was singing. She couldn't hear the words, but the melody was unmistakable. That same gentle rise and fall, the hymn that had haunted her since the first night. Her fingers curled around the edge of the bench. She wished she could be there, not to be seen, not even to be forgiven. Just to feel it again, that impossible warmth, that strange, unspoken belonging. But the invitation hadn't come this time. Perhaps they thought once was enough. Perhaps they were right. She returned to her bunk early, the barracks already dark. Marta was asleep, curled under a thin blanket, her back to the wall. Greta whispered good night from across the room, but even her voice sounded distant. Anneliese sat on the edge of her mattress, the scarf in her lap, the hymnal resting beneath her hands. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The words were already inside her. She closed her eyes. The pastor's voice echoed faintly in her mind. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. That night in the church had been the first time she'd heard those words without irony, without the weight of propaganda or pride. Just peace, just goodwill, given freely, even to those who did not deserve it. She whispered them into the quiet. The words felt thin at first, almost too fragile to hold their shape, but they remained. And then, after a long pause, she added something else. I don't know if you can hear me, she said, but if you can, I want to believe this isn't the end of who I am. Her voice broke halfway through, but she didn't stop. I want to know what they know. I want to feel what they feel when they sing. No thunder replied. No warmth swept over her, just stillness. But this stillness didn't feel empty. It felt patient, listening. She lay down slowly, the scarf still wrapped around her shoulders, and closed her eyes to the sound of silence that no longer frightened her. For the first time in a long time, she did not fall asleep in fear. She fell asleep in hope. Weeks passed. The war continued, somewhere far beyond the fences. But inside Camp Seagullville, the cold began to loosen its grip. Routines returned: laundry, kitchen, letters from home that arrived like ghosts, half legible and damp with distance. Anneliese moved through the days quietly. She didn't speak much, but something in her eyes had softened. Not because the pain had vanished, but because she was learning how to carry it differently. The scarf still lived beneath her pillow. The hymnal remained tucked in the corner of her bunk, its pages bent, its cover worn. She hadn't returned to the church, not yet. But the song remained not just in her memory, but in the room itself. Other girls hummed now too. Some sang when they worked, bold enough to let the notes rise. They no longer asked permission. The melody had become theirs. One morning, Anneliese stood alone by the edge of the fence, watching a bird hop between the frost-covered branches of a nearby tree. Its wings fluttered like pages turning. Behind her, The camp stirred, boots on gravel, pots clanging, someone shouting in two languages at once. But she didn't turn. She just stood there, breathing in the cold air, thinking of the boy in the pew, the woman with the maroon coat, the warmth of candlelight, and strangers who had looked at her not as a prisoner, but as a person. She had not forgotten. She never would. She didn't become a believer overnight. She didn't suddenly understand grace or redemption or why anyone would choose to forgive those who had not asked for it. But she remembered how it felt. And she carried that memory like a small flame in the dark, not bright enough to guide others yet, but enough to keep her from going numb. Sometimes that was enough. In her next letter home, she finally mentioned the church. Just one sentence. I heard a song that made me cry in a place I didn't expect to feel welcome. No names, no explanations. Just truth, quiet and simple, like a prayer that had waited too long to be spoken. She sealed the letter and handed it to the guard. Then she returned to her barracks, pulled out the hymnal, and opened it not to read, but to remember. Her fingers traced the words. Her lips moved silently, and in the stillness of that gray winter morning, Anneliese smiled, not because the war was over, but because something in her had finally begun. If this story moved you, there are more untold truths, like this, quiet, human, and real. Subscribe to WW2 Rations and Revelations to discover the forgotten side of war, one soul at a time.